In the stillness of the night, it is easy to forget that the way we speak about love, desire, and intimacy is itself a product of our own time. We live in an era when most adults have the privilege of privacy, of choosing a partner for reasons of affection rather than of dynastic alliance, and of being able to explore what gives them pleasure without fearing the wrath of the heavens. Our modern world is one of soft beds and whispers in the dark, of novels and films that celebrate romance, of songs and poems that promise love as an adventure of the soul. For many of us, the questions of who we love and how we love are ones we ask ourselves on our own terms. We have the luxury of thinking of sex as something that happens behind closed doors, as an expression of personal choice, as something that can be discussed openly among friends or, if we wish, kept safely secret. Yet this gentle view of intimacy is a very recent invention. Go back a handful of centuries, and the landscape of desire looks utterly different. Between the 12th and 17th centuries, the era we often call the medieval period and the early modern age, sexuality was a domain woven tightly into the fabric of religion, law, superstition, and power. There were no novels celebrating soulmates, no scientific explanations for why we feel the things we feel. Love was as much about property as about affection, and the act of sex itself was laden with meanings we can scarcely imagine. The body was not a private possession but a battleground of ideas. The desires that rose in the quiet of the night were policed from the pulpit, whispered about in marketplaces, confessed with trembling voices in dark wooden booths. In this tale, we will wander through those centuries with a candle in hand, peering into the corners where such secrets lived. We will uncover the strange practices people thought necessary to secure their souls and their families, the odd beliefs about what bodies were and how they functioned, the commerce and control that entangled intimacy in webs of debt and power. It is a history that oscillates between the grim and the absurd, the tender and the terrifying. And as you listen, you may find yourself feeling a chill that has nothing to do with temperature, a whisper of empathy for those who had to navigate love and lust in a world so different from our own, and a sigh of relief that you were born in a later age. This story is not a catalog of titillation, but a journey into how sexuality was understood and enforced. It is an invitation to lie back, close your eyes, and let your imagination drift to flickering candlelight and the creaking timbers of medieval bedrooms. As you drift toward sleep, you will be guided through a world where shame and desire were public, where private acts were public concerns, and where those who stepped outside the boundaries faced penalties both earthly and eternal. This is the story of the most bizarre sexual practices of the medieval era, and of the people who lived and loved in spite of them. Before we begin our exploration, allow me to welcome you to this quiet corner of the internet. Here, amid the soft glow of your screen and the comfort of your bed, you have chosen to travel back in time with me. If you find peace in these stories, if you enjoy the way history can be both a lullaby and a lesson, I invite you to let me know. A simple click to like this video, a note to subscribe to this channel, helps these whispers reach others who may also need solace and curiosity in their nights. Your support tells the algorithms that there is value in slow narratives, in learning as we drift towards sleep. I would love to hear from you too. Tell me in the comments below. From where in the world are you listening, and what time is it as you press play? I am always delighted to imagine this community scattered across continents and time zones, joined by a shared fascination with the past. Perhaps you are wrapped in blankets as the first snow falls outside your window, or perhaps you are listening in the cool darkness before dawn. Wherever you are, whenever you are, know that you are part of a circle of wanderers through history, seeking respite and knowledge in equal measure. And now, let us gently step out of our present and into the past. Make yourself comfortable, nestle deeper into your pillows. Close your eyes if you wish, or simply soften your gaze. Take a deep breath in, letting the air fill your chest, and then let it go. Feel the weight of the day slip away as you prepare to journey to a different world. In a moment, the hum of electronics will fade, replaced by the crackle of a hearth fire and the flicker of tallow candles. The scent of beeswax and the faint aroma of dried herbs will fill the air. Outside, snow may be falling, muffling all sound, or rain may be tapping lightly at your window. Wherever you are, imagine stepping through an ancient wooden door and into a chamber illuminated only by soft light. The voices you hear will be centuries old, and yet they will speak to you as if from just outside your ear. Let us walk together into the shadowed rooms of history, letting curiosity be our guide and compassion be our companion. Relax your shoulders, loosen your jaw, and allow yourself to drift. This is your time to listen, to reflect, and to rest. From the moment of its ascendancy in Western Europe, the Christian Church positioned itself as the arbiter of not only spiritual life, but of bodily life as well. There was, in the minds of churchmen, no part of human existence that did not have moral implications, and nowhere was this more evident than in the sphere of sex. Sexuality was considered a gift from God, a means by which humans could fulfill the divine command to be fruitful and multiply. Yet it was also regarded with deep suspicion. Because it stirred powerful passions and distracted from contemplation of the divine, desire was seen as something to be channeled and contained. To that end, clerics wrote elaborate rules detailing when, how, and under what circumstances married couples could engage in sexual relations, and they denounced any act that deviated from these prescriptions as sinful. Medieval penitential manuals, written as guides for confessors, are filled with admonitions about the proper exercise of marital sex. They set forth a calendar of abstinence that makes modern restrictions seem mild. Couples were expected to refrain from intercourse not only during Lent and Advent, the great fasting periods of the liturgical year, but also on every Sunday, every Wednesday, and every Friday. They were forbidden from engaging in the marital act for at least 3 days before receiving communion, before undertaking a pilgrimage, or before entering battle. The rhythms of marital life were thus punctuated by the rhythms of the Church, reinforcing the idea that sex was something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Even when the calendar permitted intimacy, the Church sought to dictate its form. The only position deemed acceptable was the so-called missionary posture, with the man on top and the woman on the bottom. This arrangement was thought to reflect the natural order: man above, woman below, spirit above, flesh below. Any departure from this, whether the couple lay side by side, or the woman on top, or whether they faced one another, was condemned as unnatural and imitative of animals. Oral sex and anal sex were denounced not merely as sins, but as acts against nature, punishable by severe penances. Masturbation, too, was framed as a misuse of the generative fluids that were believed to contain the life force. The overarching message was clear: sex was permissible only within the narrow confines of marital duty, for the purpose of procreation, and in a manner that symbolically maintained the hierarchical order of creation. Behind these rules lay a worldview that saw the human body as a battleground between virtue and vice. Medieval theologians such as Augustine of Hippo taught that original sin had introduced disorder into our desires. Lust, or concupiscence, was the involuntary movement of our bodies toward pleasure, a movement that could override the rational will. While marriage was instituted as a remedy for concupiscence, it was not considered a license to indulge. Rather, it was a concession to weakness, a lesser evil. The ideal Christian life was celibacy. The next best thing was married continence. Within this framework, the rules about sexual conduct served as a series of fences around a dangerous pasture. They were meant to prevent the flames of lust from escaping their proper hearth and burning down the house of the soul. For lay people, these strictures were often honored in the breach rather than in the observance. A farmer and his wife, exhausted from a day's labor, may not have consulted a calendar before climbing into bed. Yet the very existence of the rules had power. They created a culture of shame around the physical aspects of marriage. They gave confessors and moralists tools to interrogate and instruct the faithful. They offered a vocabulary with which to talk about guilt and self-control. In an age when many could not read, the Church's teachings on sex were learned by listening to sermons that thundered against lust, by overhearing gossip about neighbors who did not restrain themselves during Lent, and by the whispered admonitions of elders warning young people against temptation. The rules thus seeped into the collective consciousness, shaping not only what people did, but how they thought about what they did. In a world where divine displeasure was feared as much as famine or plague, these rules were not theoretical. They were believed to have real consequences for the prosperity of crops, the health of children, and the fate of immortal souls. If the rules of the flesh were written on parchment, the policing of those rules happened in the shadows of the confessional. The confessional was not yet the wooden booth with a screen that we might imagine. Rather, it was an intimate exchange in which a layperson knelt before his or her priest and laid bare the secrets of the heart. Medieval penitents were instructed to confess not only their actions, but their thoughts. And nowhere was the line between thought and deed more fraught than in matters of sex. The penitential manuals that priests consulted contained exhaustive lists of sexual sins, with prescribed penances calibrated to the perceived gravity of each act. Whether a husband had contemplated his wife too lustfully, whether a couple had engaged in intercourse on a forbidden day, whether spouses had enjoyed one another's touch without immediate intent to conceive, each scenario had a corresponding number of days of fasting or almsgiving assigned. One of the most infamous of these manuals was the Decretum of Burchard of Worms, composed around the year 1010. It contains a catalog of questions for the confessor to ask, including, have you by any chance committed fornication with yourself? Have you by any chance performed the unmentionable act? Have you by any chance acted like an animal? With your wife or another woman? The penances assigned for these acts were often severe. Weeks or months of fasting on bread and water, pilgrimages to distant shrines, or public vigils at the church door. The purpose was not only to punish, but to purify. The penitent was to feel, through bodily deprivation, the wrongness of having misused the body's energies. Yet confession was more than a mechanism of control. It was also one of the few spaces where people could speak of their desire. In an age when discussing sex openly could lead to public censure, the confessional provided a sanctioned space for secrets. Men and women confessed to lustful dreams, to fantasies of neighbors or nobility, to fears that they could not satisfy their spouses. Priests, while charged with admonishing, were also trained to comfort. Manuals advised them to listen without lechery or scandal. A good confessor might counsel a husband who struggled to wait until Sunday was over, or a wife who dreaded her husband's advances, reminding them that mutual consent and kindness were virtues even within the narrow definitions of marital duty. Shame, however, was the prevailing emotion. The language of the time described sexual sins as filthy, unmentionable, bestial. Even within marriage, pleasure was suspect. A husband who took too much delight in his wife's body might be told to atone. A woman who initiated intimacy might be urged to repent of immodesty. Masturbation was condemned not only as wasting seed, but as a selfish act that deprived one's spouse. Couples who ventured beyond the missionary position were compared to pigs or dogs. The effect of this rhetoric was to internalize the idea that one's body was both dangerous and humiliating. People learned to police their own thoughts, to blush at their own impulses. In doing so, they reinforced the power of the institution that set those boundaries. The community itself participated in this regime of shame. Neighbors gossiped about those who seemed too affectionate, or who bore children suspiciously close together. Women were urged to be quiet during sex so that their cries would not be heard by others. Talkative wives were sometimes accused of being lustful. Men were told to control themselves, lest their nightly visits to the marital bed become a topic of tavern humor. In many towns, married couples even had to obtain permission from their parish priest to resume sexual relations after childbirth, and gossip could ensure that those who broke this rule were shamed. The confessional thus existed within a broader landscape of surveillance and whispering, where a slip of the tongue or an overheard sigh could mark one as morally lax. That shame has left traces in the writing of the period. The chroniclers who recorded confessional questions did so anonymously, often prefacing their lists with apologies for their own blushes. Theologians writing about marital pleasure did so with hedging phrases like, as the apostle says, quoting St. Paul's admonition that it is better to marry than to burn. Ordinary people's voices are harder to hear, but in letters and court records, we find hints of their struggles. Petitions from husbands begging bishops to discipline wives who refused them, pleas from wives asking to be separated from abusive husbands, and confessions of despair from those who believed their desires had damned them. Shame, confession, and penance formed a triad that shaped not only behavior, but also inner life. In the murmur of sins whispered to a priest, in the burning of cheeks behind veils, we glimpse the profound weight that sexual regulation placed on medieval souls. No symbol from the Middle Ages has captured the modern imagination quite like the chastity belt. In films and cartoons, it is depicted as a hulking apparatus of iron, a lockbox for the lower body, complete with hinges, padlocks, and sometimes menacing spikes. The image conjures a jealous husband heading off to the Crusades and locking up his wife's sexuality, the key dangling from his neck as he marches east. But how much of this picture corresponds to historical reality, and how much is a projection of later anxieties and fantasies onto the past? The first thing to understand is that references to chastity belts in medieval sources are exceedingly rare. There is no evidence that crusaders literally locked up their wives. Crusade preaching emphasized chastity and the spiritual benefits of leaving one's household, but it did not include instructions on how to prevent infidelity through hardware. The earliest visual depictions of devices resembling chastity belts appear in Renaissance Italy in satirical drawings and allegorical engravings. For example, a drawing from around 1400 shows a woman wearing a belt-like garment covered with thorns, her lover using a key to unlock it while a fool looks on. The picture is clearly comic, a commentary on jealousy and desire rather than a record of standard practice. The few physical objects that have been displayed in museums as chastity belts have often turned out to be forgeries or later inventions. Many of these metal belts date from the 19th century, a time when Victorian doctors were experimenting with devices to prevent masturbation in women and men. Some belts were designed with sharp edges to deter touching. Others were meant to prevent patients in mental asylums from injuring themselves. These objects, when later found in collections, were misattributed to the Middle Ages by curators eager to display the strangeness of the past. When historians have submitted such belts to metallurgical analysis, they have often revealed modern manufacturing techniques inconsistent with medieval metallurgy. This is not to say that medieval and early modern people were uninterested in controlling women's sexuality. The myth of the chastity belt speaks to real anxieties about fidelity, honor, and lineage. In an era before reliable paternity tests, a man's ability to pass on his property and name depended on his confidence that his children were truly his. Laws and customs around female chastity were strict. In many regions, an unmarried woman who became pregnant could be punished by whipping, exile, or death. Adulterous wives could have their noses cut off, a punishment designed to scar them visually. Widows who inherited property were expected to remain chaste, lest they dilute their lineage. Fathers arranged marriages in part to ensure that their daughters' sexuality was bound to alliances that benefited the family. The chastity belt myth exaggerates, but does not invent the underlying reality. Women's bodies were often treated as repositories of male honor. So where did the legend of iron belts originate? Some scholars suggest it may have arisen in the 14th and 15th centuries as a bawdy joke. Satirists and moralists used the image of a belt to mock overprotective husbands or to warn against lust. Over time, the satire was taken as fact. By the 18th century, antiquarians were beginning to display supposed chastity belts as curiosities, cementing their place in popular imagination. The 19th century added a layer of pseudo-scientific credibility when doctors used similar devices to treat masturbation. Thus, a combination of medieval satire, early modern misinterpretation, and Victorian prudery gave birth to a long-lived myth. What matters for our story is not whether iron belts were common, but how deeply the idea resonates with the period's mentality. Whether by law, by religious rule, or by social pressure, women's sexuality was hemmed in on all sides. Marriages were arranged to control alliances, punishments for adultery were severe, confessional questions probed women's desires, and physicians and theologians described female sexuality as insatiable and dangerous if not checked. The chastity belt, real or imagined, is a fitting emblem for a culture that placed locks, legal, moral, and physical, on desire. Even if no medieval smith forged a metal girdle to imprison a woman's body, countless fathers, husbands, priests, and physicians sought to harness and direct her sexuality. The myth endures because it captures, in a single stark image, the reality of control. To understand why medieval people did what they did in the bedroom, one must look beyond theology to science, or rather, to what passed for science at the time. The dominant medical framework inherited from antiquity and elaborated by Arab and European physicians was the theory of humors. According to humoral theory, the human body was made up of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that corresponded to the elements air, water, fire, and earth. Health consisted of keeping these humors in balance, and disease resulted from an excess or deficiency of one or more. The humors were associated with qualities. Blood was hot and wet, phlegm cold and wet, yellow bile hot and dry, and black bile cold and dry. Treatments, including dietary prescriptions and bleeding, were designed to restore equilibrium. Sexual difference was understood through this lens. Men were believed to be naturally hotter and drier than women, whose bodies were cooler and moister. This heat was thought to be the force that transformed blood into semen. Galen and his followers posited that women, being colder, were imperfect men. Their reproductive organs were essentially the same as men's, but turned inward because of insufficient heat. The vagina and uterus were seen as an inverted penis and scrotum. Because women were less hot, they were thought to produce less potent seed. Conception, according to the Aristotelian Galenic model, required the emission of seed by both man and woman, with the man providing form and the woman providing matter. This belief had significant implications for sexual practice. Many physicians argued that women must experience orgasm in order to emit their seed and conceive. A husband, therefore, had a duty to ensure his wife's pleasure, not for her sake, but to secure heirs. Other writers were less positive about female desire. The influential 12th century compendium known as the Trotula, a set of texts on women's medicine, acknowledges that women experience lust and offers advice on how to moderate it. One of the treatises warns that when women are too lecherous, they should be bled from the ankle or given cooling foods such as lettuce and fish. Excess heat in women was thought to lead to unbridled sexuality, whereas excess cold could cause the womb to wander. The idea of the wandering womb, inherited from Hippocrates, held that the uterus was a mobile organ that could travel throughout a woman's body, causing suffocation and convulsions. Sexual intercourse was recommended as a treatment to keep the womb in place. The connection between sex and health was thus bidirectional. Too much desire could make one sick, but too little could make one sicker. Physicians cautioned against excessive ejaculation in men, arguing that it weakened the body. Semen, in this view, carried vital heat. To lose too much was akin to losing blood. Young men were urged to abstain from masturbation and limit their sexual encounters, lest they become pale and listless. Older men, who were thought to possess less heat, were often advised to cease sexual activity altogether. Women, on the other hand, were said to retain superfluous fluids if they did not have intercourse. Menstruation was one way for the body to expel these, but sex was another. This led to the paradoxical situation in which women were both warned against excessive desire and encouraged to engage in sex to maintain health. Dietary and environmental recommendations accompanied these theories. Aphrodisiacs and anaphrodisiacs were prescribed according to humoral principles. Foods considered hot and moist, such as eggs, onions, and almonds, were believed to stimulate lust. Cool and moist foods like cucumbers and lettuce were thought to dampen it. Spices were said to inflame desire. Monks and nuns were sometimes cautioned to avoid pepper and garlic. Cold baths could calm sexual urges. Warm baths could arouse them. The climate itself was implicated. Inhabitants of colder northern regions were thought to be less lustful than those of warm Mediterranean lands. These beliefs reinforced existing stereotypes about ethnic and regional differences in sexuality. In day-to-day life, such theories offered a framework for understanding bodily sensations that were otherwise mysterious. A woman who felt sudden heat in her abdomen might worry that her womb was restless. She might seek a midwife's counsel or a physician's bleeding. A man who grew fatigued after sex might attribute it to loss of vital humors. He might reduce his frequency or alter his diet. Parents anxious about their daughter's chastity might feed them cool, damp foods. Physicians wrote entire treatises on how to regulate sexual appetite, combining religious admonition with medical advice. While modern readers may smile at the idea of a wandering womb or of lettuce as a passion suppressant, for medieval Europeans these notions provided a sense of control over the unpredictable force of desire. They also underscore how deeply the body and the cosmos were intertwined in the medieval mind. Sex was not just a private act, but part of the larger balancing act of the universe. Virginity in the medieval period was more than a personal characteristic. It was a commodity, a guarantee of lineage, a symbol of honor, and a theological ideal. For women in particular, being a virgin at marriage could be the difference between a favorable alliance and social ruin. Virginity signaled that a woman's reproductive capacities were unclaimed by any man other than her husband, ensuring that the children she bore would be legitimate heirs. In religious imagery, virginity represented spiritual purity. Saints such as Agnes, Catherine, and above all, the Virgin Mary, embodied an ideal of untouched feminine holiness. How, then, could a community verify what was supposed to be an internal state? The result was a proliferation of so-called virginity tests, some physical, some behavioral, all fraught with uncertainty. The most notorious of these was the belief that an intact hymen signified virginity. Physicians and midwives were sometimes asked to inspect a bride-to-be to confirm her status. Yet the hymen is a thin membrane that can stretch or tear from non-sexual activities such as riding a horse, climbing, or even using coarse cloth for hygiene. Medical writers were aware of this. Some noted that the presence or absence of the hymen was not a reliable indicator. Nonetheless, popular imagination held that a physical barrier existed and that its breach would be accompanied by blood. Wedding night linens were sometimes displayed to the family the morning after as proof of consummation. A blood-stained sheet could serve as evidence that the bride had been virginal. The absence of blood could lead to accusations of deception. Another so-called test was to observe a woman's gait. One 14th century author claimed that virgins walked differently from non-virgins, with a more modest and closed step. Others examined the complexion or the clarity of the eyes, believing that sexual activity caused subtle changes. The Trotula and other medical texts recommended examining the size and tightness of the breasts. It was thought that virgin breasts were firmer and higher. Midwives sometimes applied pessaries or ointments that would cause pain or swelling if a woman had previously had intercourse, interpreting the reaction as evidence of prior activity. None of these methods had any basis in physiological fact, but they persisted because they provided a veneer of certainty in a context where male honor depended on female chastity. In some parts of Europe, especially in southern France and northern Italy, communities developed rituals around the verification of virginity. One practice involved inserting a symbolic object, such as a small ball of wool, into the bride before the wedding night. If the object was found intact afterwards, the bride was declared virginal. Another involved testing the bride's urine. Certain folk healers claimed that a virgin's urine reacted differently when mixed with wine or barley. These tests had more to do with ritual than with empirical evidence. They functioned as performances of virtue rather than as genuine medical examinations. Their very arbitrariness underscores the anxiety surrounding female sexuality. Because there was no sure way to know, communities invented elaborate procedures to reassure themselves. The consequences of failing a virginity test could be severe. In medieval law courts, husbands could annul marriages if they could prove that their wives were not virgins at the time of marriage. Women accused of deception could be returned to their families, their reputations damaged beyond repair. In extreme cases, especially where property or titles were involved, accusations could lead to violence or legal punishment. For the women, the humiliation of being examined, the fear of being found wanting, and the knowledge that their bodies were objects of scrutiny added layers of anxiety to what was already a momentous life transition. Virginity tests reveal not only medical ignorance but also social priorities. Male chastity was far less scrutinized. A bride was not given the right to annul a marriage if her husband was not virginal. Male experience before marriage could even enhance a man's status as worldly and virile. The focus on female virginity served to uphold patriarchal structures. By controlling women's bodies and by tying their worth to their sexual history, medieval society maintained male dominance over inheritance, lineage, and honor. while the church preached virginity for both sexes, in practice it was women who bore the burden of proof. In our current age, virginity is understood as a concept rather than a physical state, and many cultures have moved away from tying a woman's value to her sexual history. Nevertheless, the specter of medieval virginity tests lingers in some contemporary attitudes. The myth of the breaking hymen and the obsession with purity have proven remarkably persistent. By looking back at these earlier practices, we can see how social anxieties about ownership, trust, and control manifested in the intimate sphere. We can also recognize the courage of the countless women who lived under such scrutiny, whose worth was judged by standards that were both invasive and impossible to meet. For medieval Europeans, sex was not only constrained by prohibitions and shame, it was also imbued with hopes and fears about fertility. The survival of families, villages, and dynasties depended on the production of heirs. Infant mortality was high, life expectancies were low, and inheritance laws often required a male heir for property to remain within a lineage. Couples who were unable to conceive faced both social stigma and economic insecurity. In this context, a host of fertility rituals and remedies emerged, blending Christian piety with folk magic and classical medicine. One of the most common strategies was to enlist the aid of saints. Certain saints were believed to intercede specifically in matters of childbirth and conception. Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, was invoked by women who had difficulty conceiving. Pilgrims traveled to shrines dedicated to her, such as those in Chartres and Canterbury, leaving votive offerings and sleeping near her relics in hopes of a miraculous pregnancy. Saint Margaret of Antioch, who had escaped from the belly of a dragon, became a protector of pregnant women. Statues of her were placed in birthing chambers, and midwives would recite prayers to her during labor. In England, the girdle of Saint Mary was a relic thought to ensure a safe delivery when worn by expectant mothers. Women tied knots in it and measured their bellies against it as their pregnancies progressed. Alongside these devotions were remedies that straddled the line between medicine and magic. Physicians recommended herbal concoctions to stimulate conception, decoctions of rue, pennyroyal, and artemisia to regulate menstruation, and mixtures of warming spices such as ginger and cinnamon to arouse desire. Hippocratic texts suggested drinking wine boiled with myrrh or applying pomegranate rind. Midwives and wise women used pessaries made of animal fat and plants to open the womb. In some regions, couples were advised to drink potions made from ground deer antler or the testicles of wild boars, substances associated with virility. A more disturbing remedy involved the consumption of powdered dried blood, sometimes from the husband, under the belief that mixing bloods would facilitate conception. Fertility rituals also involved symbolic actions. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, newly married couples would leap over a broom or a branch to ensure fertility. In rural Italy, women who longed for a child might sit astride the plow in a fallow field at night and recite incantations to the earth goddess-like figure of fertility. In France, some families would light candles before statues of the Madonna and then extinguish them in their marital bed, believing that the transfer of light would encourage conception. In the British Isles, barren women sometimes crawled under bramble arches or lay on fertility stones, ancient megaliths associated with prehistoric worship. These acts blended pagan motifs with Christian prayers, reflecting the syncretic spiritual world of the Middle Ages. Animals played a role as well. The hare, known for its rapid reproduction, was a symbol of fertility. Couples might consume hare meat or keep a hare's foot under their pillow. The rooster, with its virility and association with dawn, was also seen as a fertility charm. Some folk healers prescribed placing a rooster's testicles beneath the bed. Charms involving eggs were widespread, rolling a fertile woman's egg along the stomach of a barren woman, or burying an egg in a field under a waxing moon, with the belief that the growth of the grain would mirror the growth of a fetus. These rites illustrate the interconnectedness medieval people saw between the cycles of nature and the cycles of human life. Not all fertility practices were benign. Infertility was sometimes attributed to witchcraft, leading to accusations and trials. A woman who failed to conceive could be suspected of being cursed or of having made a pact with the devil. Neighbors might whisper that a spiteful midwife had stolen her fertility. Remedies could veer into the macabre. The bones of stillborn babies were ground into powders, Amulets made from the teeth of executed criminals were worn around the neck. These darker practices underscore the desperation and fear that surrounded infertility. In a world without reproductive medicine, people grasped at any possibility, no matter how unlikely or ethically troubling. Through all of this, we glimpse a more hopeful side of medieval sexuality. Despite the layers of shame and control, couples longed for the joys of parenthood. They prayed, experimented, and endured painful remedies out of love for a child yet to be born. The mixing of prayer and potion, of church and field, reveals a worldview in which the supernatural and the natural were not opposed but intertwined. Success was never guaranteed, but the rituals themselves offered comfort, a sense of agency in the face of uncertainty, a community of women and men sharing secrets and stories, and a belief that somewhere in the cosmos there was a saint or a spirit listening to their pleas for life. While the church and moralists insisted that sex belonged only within marriage and only for procreation, medieval cities buzzed with another reality, the commerce of desire. Prostitution was widespread in the Middle Ages, and far from being completely underground, it was often regulated by municipal authorities. Many city councils considered prostitution a necessary evil. Men who were not married, or whose marriages were not yet consummated, were thought to need an outlet for their lust. Better, officials reasoned, to have them frequent prostitutes than to seduce respectable women or turn to sodomy. Brothels thus became part of urban infrastructure, situated near city gates, riverbanks, and entertainment districts. These establishments took many forms. In London, they were known as stews, a term that originally referred to bathing houses. By the 14th century, Southwark, across the River Thames, boasted a number of stews licensed by the Bishop of Winchester. The sex workers who lived and worked there were colloquially called Winchester geese. In Germany, municipal brothels were marked by specific symbols, such as a wooden doll or a red light, to signal the nature of the business. In Italian cities like Florence and Venice, brothels were sometimes run by the city itself. The commune would own the building, hire a madam to manage it, and use the profits to fund public works. The presence of a brothel could, perversely, be a sign of civic responsibility. Regulation came with rules that aimed to limit the perceived harm of prostitution while ensuring revenue and public order. Prostitutes were often required to wear specific clothing, such as striped hoods or yellow veils, so that they could be distinguished from respectable women. They were forbidden from working during certain religious festivals and from soliciting near churches or markets. Brothel keepers had to pay taxes and, in some cities, were obligated to provide health care for the women in their employ. Records from municipal courts show fines levied against prostitutes who broke curfew or against madams who allowed theft or violence in their houses. The intention was to create a controlled environment. Sex work was tolerated but confined to designated areas and subject to oversight. Life for the women working in these establishments was often harsh. Many entered prostitution because of poverty, widowhood, or abandonment. Some were sold into brothels by their families. Others were trafficked from rural areas under false promises of domestic work. Once inside, leaving was difficult. Madams controlled their movements, and debts accumulated quickly from room and board. Physical abuse was common. Illnesses, particularly venereal diseases, spread rapidly. Although municipal authorities claimed to regulate health, there was little effective treatment. Prostitutes were stigmatized socially and legally. They could be beaten by clients with impunity and were excluded from most forms of charity and religious comfort. Yet despite these hardships, some women found in prostitution a degree of autonomy. Earnings, though meager, could be more than what they might make as servants or laborers. In rare cases, a prostitute could save enough to open her own small shop or to marry. Religious attitudes towards prostitution were complex. The church condemned fornication as sin, yet some theologians argued that prostitution served a social function by preventing greater evils. Augustine likened prostitutes to sewage in a palace, foul but necessary. In practice, clergy sometimes visited brothels themselves. Confessors offered absolution to prostitutes who repented, but they also pressured them to leave their trade. Confraternities and lay charities occasionally took up the cause of rescuing fallen women, establishing Magdalene houses where they could live and work. often in textile production under religious supervision. These efforts were inconsistent and sometimes coercive, but they indicate a tension between condemnation and compassion. The regulation of prostitution also intersected with politics. Rulers used brothels to reward soldiers, to host diplomatic visitors, or to raise funds. In some wars, armies forcibly conscripted women to serve as camp followers. In frontier towns, brothels were seen as markers of urban civilization, distinguishing them from rural villages. Conversely, during outbreaks of plague or moral reform movements, authorities might close brothels only to reopen them when business pressures returned. The lives of sex workers were thus subject to the ebb and flow of civic needs and moral panics. Their stories seldom appear in chronicles except in court records, but their ubiquitous presence testifies to the gap between official sexual doctrine and everyday practice. As we walk the cobbled streets of medieval cities in our imagination, we should listen for the voices of the women behind the curtained doorways, negotiating survival in an economy built on desire. While prostitution occupied a precarious position between tolerance and condemnation in medieval society, there were arenas where the boundaries between sacred and sinful blurred in particularly striking ways. The notion of sacred prostitution often evokes images of temple courtesans in the ancient Mediterranean or Near East. In the Middle Ages, there was no institutionalized system of sex for the gods. However, there were contexts in which sexuality and religiosity intersected in troubling ways. Pilgrimage sites were one such arena. When large numbers of pilgrims descended on towns to venerate relics or participate in festivals, a temporary economy sprang up to cater to them. Innkeepers, vendors, entertainers, and inevitably prostitutes followed the crowds. Chroniclers complained that the roads to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Canterbury were lined with brothels. Prostitutes set up shop near shrines, sometimes renting stalls from churches or monasteries, eager to profit from the influx of visitors. This juxtaposition of piety and pleasure scandalized some preachers, who likened the trade to demons lurking at the gates of paradise. Others turned a blind eye, reasoning that the presence of prostitutes prevented worse offenses, such as the seduction of local virgins or homosexual encounters. Within the courts of kings and princes, sexuality took on a ceremonial character. Courtesans, women who served as companions and lovers to wealthy men, occupied a niche between prostitute and noble consort. Unlike brothel workers, courtesans were often educated, musically trained, and adept at conversation. They were known by names and reputations. They could attend court functions, influence patrons, and in rare cases, accumulate wealth and power. While their relationships were transactional, they were also entwined with politics and art. Poets wrote verses in their honor, and painters immortalized their beauty. The church condemned the keeping of courtesans, but many prelates themselves maintained mistresses. In Venice and Florence, some courtesans adopted quasi-religious personas, dressing in veils and jewels, presenting themselves as embodiments of celestial beauty. The boundary between sacred and profane became a performance. Another manifestation of sacred sinful crossover was in the phenomenon of holy harlots, a term used by polemicists to describe women who engaged in sexual acts under the guise of pious charity. Some early modern pamphlets accused certain religious orders of maintaining secret brothels. In reality, these tales were often exaggerations used to discredit rivals. However, there were instances of religious houses providing lodging for women who sold sex to travelers. In some cases, abbacies and priors accepted rents from brothels on monastery lands, rationalizing that the money could be put to holy use. The moral ambiguity of such arrangements speaks to the entanglement of commerce, hospitality, and charity in a world where institutions needed income to survive. Outside of Christianity, Jewish and Muslim communities in medieval Europe had their own relationships with prostitution. In some Islamic contexts, the practice of temporary marriage, muta, allowed men to contract marriages of short duration, which could resemble prostitution in the eyes of outsiders. Jewish law forbade prostitution but permitted concubinage, where a man lived with a woman without marriage but provided for her financially. In Islamic Spain, elite courts boasted entertainments that included slave musicians and dancers who sometimes had sexual relationships with patrons. These practices, though culturally distinct, illustrate the broader medieval idea that sexuality could be both regulated and ritualized in ways that complicated the simple binary of sacred versus profane. For the women involved, whether they were pilgrims' companions, courtesans, or so-called holy harlots, the combination of religious language and sexual labor offered a precarious shelter. Aligning themselves with sanctity could lend a veneer of respectability or protection. A prostitute might choose to live near a church in the hope of safer clients. A courtesan might sponsor a chapel to bolster her image. Yet this sanctification did not erase the risks of violence, disease, and social ostracism. Instead, it reveals how women navigated the structures imposed on them. By adopting roles that reflected male fantasies of purity and sin, they carved out spaces in which they could exercise agency, however limited. Ultimately, the intersection of sex and the sacred in medieval Europe underscores the contradictions of the era. A culture that idealized virginity and denounced fornication simultaneously tolerated and commodified sex. Clergymen who preached chastity visited brothels. Saints associated with fertility were honored with rituals that bordered on sympathetic magic. Courtesans, denounced as sinners, were also muses for devotional poets. These contradictions highlight the gap between doctrine and practice, between the high ideals of the church and the messy reality of human desire. They invite us to view medieval sexuality not as a monolithic block of repression, but as a complex landscape where piety and pleasure coexisted in uneasy alliance. The commerce of desire was inseparable from the commerce of disease. In a world without antibiotics, sexually transmitted infections posed a terrifying threat. Although the Great Pox, what we now call syphilis, did not appear in Europe until the end of the 15th century, other maladies circulated widely. Medieval writers referred to the burning, likely gonorrhea, and to the itch, or the mange, skin conditions that may have been syphilitic sores or other infections. These ailments were sometimes grouped under the general term venereal disease, named after Venus, the goddess of love, as if to underscore their sexual origin. Because medicine of the period had limited diagnostic tools, diseases were often described by their symptoms rather than their causes. One might read of men whose urine scalded like boiling water, or of women with ulcers and swellings. Leprosy, a term used for a variety of chronic skin diseases, was sometimes thought to result from sexual excess. Medieval medical texts link impurity of the womb to foul discharges and fevers. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, physicians and theologians turned to moral explanations. Venereal diseases were interpreted as divine retribution for sin. A man who visited prostitutes and returned with sores might be admonished that God was punishing him for fornication. The belief that illness was a marker of moral failing intensified the shame associated with sex and with the women who sold it. Treatment for these diseases ranged from the ineffective to the dangerous. Mercury was a common remedy. Physicians applied it in ointments or administered it orally. Patients subjected to mercury cures experienced salivation, tooth loss, and neurological damage, often as bad as or worse than the disease. Bathing in hot springs or steam baths was another prescription, based on the idea that heat could purge bad humors. Herbal concoctions, such as decoctions of guaiacum wood imported from the Caribbean in the 16th century, were believed to cleanse the blood. Diets of boiled vegetables and abstinence from meat and alcohol were recommended. Some charlatans sold amulets or potions guaranteed to cure the French disease, a term for syphilis in Italy, the Neapolitan disease, a term in France, or the Spanish disease in England, each blaming a foreign nation for the scourge. Fear of contagion influenced social and legal attitudes. Prostitutes were often scapegoated as vectors of disease. Municipal ordinances sometimes required them to undergo inspections or to carry certificates of health. In London, Southwark, officials appointed searchers to examine sex workers for signs of infection, though the examinations were superficial and the results unreliable. Brothels could be temporarily closed during outbreaks, and women found to be ill might be expelled into the streets where they had fewer means of survival. The irony was that it was often clients who transmitted infections among sex workers and then back to their wives, perpetuating the cycle. Beyond the brothel, fear of venereal disease seeped into popular imagination. Satirical poems described lecherous monks rotting from the inside, a moral warning wrapped in humor. Moralists warned young men that a single night of pleasure could lead to lifelong suffering. Artists painted allegorical scenes in which personified diseases pursued sinners. These representations reinforced the link between sexuality and sickness, feeding paranoia. Married couples, too, worried about disease as a sign of infidelity. A woman who discovered sores on her husband might suspect him of visiting prostitutes. A husband who noticed his wife's illness might accuse her of adultery. Trust within marriages could erode under the specter of contamination. Some religious leaders leveraged fear of disease to encourage chastity. Sermons proclaimed that venereal sores were outward manifestations of inner corruption. Confessors urged penitents to see their suffering as a call to repentance. Yet there were also voices of compassion. Some physicians acknowledged that disease could strike innocent spouses as easily as philanderers. Certain hospices, such as those run by religious orders, provided care for people with disfiguring conditions, though often segregated from healthy populations. The tension between moral judgment and medical care reveals a society struggling to reconcile spiritual beliefs with bodily realities. In time, the arrival of syphilis around 1495 dramatically heightened these fears. The disease spread rapidly across Europe, leaving hideous lesions and madness in its wake. It seemed to confirm preachers' warnings that sexual sin led to apocalypse. Treatments grew more desperate. Some patients were burned with red-hot irons, others subjected to purges and bleeding. Even as physicians began to describe the disease more systematically, they could not agree on its cause. Meanwhile, sex workers bore the brunt of blame, facing increased surveillance, violence, and marginalization. The shadow of venereal disease thus looms over the late medieval and early modern imagination, coloring attitudes toward sex with dread. It reminds us that the human body, so celebrated in love and so scrutinized by religion, was also vulnerable to forces beyond understanding and control. Not all medieval sexual practices revolved around consensual relations, even within marriage. Forced and arranged marriages were commonplace across Europe, reflecting the social and economic functions of marriage. For elites, marriage served to forge alliances, secure property, and ensure the succession of titles. For peasants, it ensured labor arrangements and social stability. In both cases, individual desires mattered little when set against family interests. A young girl could be betrothed at birth, her future mapped out in contracts long before she understood the meaning of the words. A widow could be forced to remarry her deceased husband's brother to keep her dowry within the family. The law permitted guardians to consent to the marriages of wards, with or without the ward's approval. The Church's insistence on mutual consent, codified in canon law in the 12th century, was honored more in theory than in practice. Children were particularly vulnerable. Canon law allowed girls to marry at 12 and boys at 14, but there were documented cases of betrothals at much younger ages, with consummation delayed. The story of Marjorie Paston, a 15th century English gentlewoman, illustrates the pressures placed on daughters. Her parents arranged her marriage without her agreement. When she expressed reluctance, they confined her, withheld food, and threatened to disown her until she consented. Her letters reveal her fear of being wed to a man she did not love, a fear common to many young women whose duty was obedience. In some parts of Europe, peasants had slightly more freedom to choose their partners, but parental approval was still crucial, and dissent could result in beatings or exile. Marriages were economic contracts. A bride brought a dowry, a sum of money, land, or goods, while the groom provided a bride price or mourning gift. These exchanges underscored that a woman's body and labor were valued commodities. If a marriage was dissolved without consummation, dowries might be returned, but if consummation had occurred, the woman's virginity was considered spent and the dowry forfeited. This financial calculus created incentives for families to marry daughters quickly, before rumors of impropriety could diminish their worth. It also meant that widows who controlled property became pawns in the schemes of male relatives eager to reclaim land or wealth. Once married, a woman was legally subordinate to her husband. The concept of coverture held that a married woman had no separate legal identity. Her husband could control her movements, labor, and sexuality. Marital rape, a term unknown in medieval law, was not recognized as a crime. The conjugal debt, the obligation spouses owed one another to engage in sexual relations, was a legal doctrine that ostensibly protected wives from husbands who withheld sex or husbands from wives who refused. In practice, it gave husbands a justification to demand sex on their terms. Court cases document husbands suing wives for failing to fulfill the debt, with judges ordering women to return to the marital bed. Violence was an accepted instrument of marital discipline. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to chastise their wives to keep them obedient. Law codes permitted moderate beating, though what counted as moderate was subjective. Brutality that resulted in permanent injury could be grounds for ecclesiastical separation, but many abuses went unpunished. Stories abound of wives beaten for suspected infidelity, infertility, or simply for speaking out of turn. In one French case from the 13th century, a man cut off his wife's nose after accusing her of adultery. The court fined him, but did not imprison him. Nose cutting was a traditional punishment for adulterous women across Europe, a permanent mark of dishonor. Men suffered no equivalent mutilations. The voices of women forced into marriages are faint but not entirely silent. In petitions to bishops and princes, some begged for annulments on the grounds of coercion. Others sought refuge in convents, pleading to be allowed to take vows rather than return to violent households. Stories of saints like Dimpna and Catherine of Alexandria, who defied forced marriages and were martyred, served as moral exemplars. These narratives provided spiritual encouragement, but rarely legal protection. For the majority of women, resistance was constrained by economic dependence and social norms. Some resorted to poison or ran away, risking death if caught. Most endured, finding small ways to assert autonomy, managing household finances, forming networks with other women, or teaching daughters how to navigate the same hazards. Forced marriage thus reveals how sexuality intersected with power. A woman's reproductive capacity was a resource to be allocated by male relatives. Consent, while celebrated in religious rhetoric, was often coerced. Men's sexual access to their wives was legally guaranteed. Women's access to safety and affection was not. The structural inequalities of medieval marriage remind us that the regulation of sex was not only about morality but also about property, labor, and lineage. As we listen to these stories, we should mourn the countless individual desires suppressed and recognize the resilience of those who found ways to survive and resist within systems designed to contain them. While forced marriage shows how patriarchal authority controlled women within family structures, sexual abuse in courts and castles reveals the predatory dynamics that flourished where power was concentrated. Medieval lords, knights, and kings wielded near absolute authority over those who lived and worked on their estates. This power extended beyond taxes and labor to bodies. Servants, pages, kitchen maids, laundresses, and serfs were vulnerable to exploitation by their masters. The myth of the droit du seigneur, or right of the first knight, the idea that a lord could claim the virginity of any bride under his jurisdiction, has captured popular imagination. There is scant evidence that such a legal right existed. However, there is ample evidence that men of rank took sexual advantage of women whose social status prevented them from refusing or seeking redress. Court documents and literary sources provide glimpses of these abuses. In the early 13th century, the English chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall reported that King John abducted the wife of a knight and kept her as his lover against her will. Chronicles from Burgundy tell of lords who fathered children with their servants and then sold the women to distant villages when pregnancies became inconvenient. Legal records from Italian city-states show cases where noblemen were fined for the crown dishonoring befran of the servant girls, a euphemism for rape. These fines were often paid to the woman's family rather than to the woman herself, treating the violation as damage to property rather than a crime against her person. Castles were hierarchical households, their daily routines undergirded by service and obligation. Young girls and boys were sent to noble households to learn manners and skills. They were expected to obey all orders. The boundaries between mentoring and abuse were ill-defined. A knight might decide that tutoring a page included sexual initiation. A baroness might punish a maid by stripping and beating her before male servants. Homosexual relationships between lords and their pages, while rarely documented, were hinted at in satirical poems. The victims of such encounters had little recourse. To accuse a powerful lord was to invite retaliation. Law courts, staffed and influenced by the very elites who perpetrated abuses, were unlikely to take the side of a servant. Kings used marriage as a political tool while maintaining lovers and concubines with relative impunity. Charles VII of France kept Agnès Sorel openly at court, showering her with jewels and influence, while his queen, Marie of Anjou, had little choice but to accept the arrangement. In England, Edward III's mistress, Alice Perrers, was notorious for her greed and power. Their relationships were consensual to the extent that the women gained wealth and status. However, these women also depended entirely on the king's favor. Should his affection wane, they faced exile or worse. Other women, less fortunate, were taken and discarded without ceremony. Royal bastards, children born from such unions, were sometimes acknowledged and provided for. More often, they were left unmentioned. Religious institutions were not immune to such abuses. Abbots and bishops sometimes used their authority to extort sexual favors from nuns and laywomen. Monasteries that were supposed to be bastions of celibacy housed scandals. In 1405, the nuns of the convent of Sant'Ambrogio in Milan brought charges against their abbess for maintaining sexual relations with priests and for forcing other nuns to participate. Although the church had laws against clerical concubinage and could impose penalties, enforcement was uneven. Many communities turned a blind eye unless scandal erupted publicly. Victims who complained risked being labeled as seducers or as liars undermining holy men. The psychological and physical toll of such abuses is difficult to recover from the sources. Rape and coercion were underreported, as shame and fear of reprisal silenced many victims. When women did speak out, they were often disbelieved. Medieval law typically required witnesses or physical evidence for a conviction. A servant raped in a lord's chamber had neither. Some women took their stories to ecclesiastical courts, seeking annulment of marriages forced by abduction or complaining that they had been lured away from their families by false promises. A handful of cases resulted in punishment for the perpetrator, usually a fine or exile. More often, the woman was married off to her attacker or compelled to enter a convent. As we move deeper into the entanglement of sex, power, and violence, we encounter another potent intersection: the link between accusations of witchcraft and female sexuality. The late Middle Ages and early modern period saw an upsurge in witch trials across Europe. While the phenomenon had many causes: economic stress, religious upheaval, political centralization, one recurring theme in the demonological literature was lust. Women who were perceived as too sexual, as too independent, or as healers with knowledge of fertility and birth control were particularly vulnerable to accusations of consorting with demons. Yet even in these oppressive circumstances, resistance occurred. Servants formed alliances and warned one another of predatory masters. Some lords faced public shaming through ballads and rumors. Authors like Christine de Pizan in the 15th century wrote about the plight of women in male-dominated societies, questioning the casual misogyny and violence of court life. Her writings, circulated among educated elites, hinted at a slowly changing consciousness. It would be centuries before legal systems recognized marital rape or created mechanisms to prosecute sexual assault across classes, but the seeds of critique were sown by those who bore witness. Reflecting on abuse in castles and courts forces us to confront the darker side of medieval chivalry. Behind the ideals of courtly love and knightly honor lay a reality of entitlement and exploitation. Sexual coercion was not an aberration, but a feature of hierarchical societies in which power over land extended naturally to power over bodies. To understand medieval sexuality fully, we must listen to the silenced voices from kitchens, stables, and bedchambers, acknowledging the harm done and the courage it took to survive. One of the most notorious manuals on witches, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published in 1487 by the Dominican inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. The text is deeply misogynistic, asserting that women are more prone to witchcraft because they are weaker in faith and more carnal in nature. The authors claim that witches have insatiable lusts, that they copulate with devils, and that their sexual appetites lead them to inflict impotence on men and miscarriages on women. They describe witches stealing men's genitals, creating illusionary penises that disappear in the hand. and collecting semen to feed incubus demons. Although the book's influence has sometimes been exaggerated, its lurid tales reflect broader anxieties about uncontrolled female sexuality. Midwives and healers were frequent targets. These women possessed knowledge of herbs that could induce abortions or regulate menstruation, knowledge that could be interpreted as interfering with God's will. When an infant died or a pregnancy ended unexpectedly, a midwife might be blamed for causing harm through malicious magic. If a man's sexual performance faltered, he could claim that a neighbor had bewitched him. In 1494, a Swiss man accused a woman named Dorothea of causing his impotence. Under torture, she confessed to having intercourse with the devil and was burned at the stake. Her story was echoed in countless accusations across Germany, France, and Scotland, where witches were said to make men impotent by tying knots in cords or burying animal organs under thresholds. The imagery of demonic sex was both fantastical and deeply eroticized. Witchcraft treatises described succubi and incubi, female and male demons, who preyed on humans in their sleep, extracting seed to create monstrous offspring. Women accused of witchcraft were interrogated about their relations with demons. Did they feel pleasure? Did the devil's member feel cold? Such questions, posed under torture, reveal the obsession of authorities with erotic details. The confessions extracted are full of forced narratives. Women said to have flown to Sabbaths where they danced naked, smeared with unguents, copulated with goats that transformed into demons, and participated in orgies parodying the Mass. Whether any women actually believed these stories is doubtful. What matters is that sexual transgression was a core element of the crime. Accusations of witchcraft also served as tools against women who defied social norms. Widows who remained unmarried but controlled property could be accused of bewitching their neighbors' livestock. Young women who bore children out of wedlock could be said to have lain with demons. Old women whose knowledge of midwifery gave them a measure of authority were painted as seducers of youth. The label of witch allowed communities to punish what they perceived as unruly female behavior. In a time when misfortunes such as illness, crop failure, and impotence had no clear explanation, blaming a witch offered a sense of control. The connection of witchcraft with sexual evil added the satisfaction of moral judgment to the mix. Punishments for convicted witches were brutal. They could include flogging, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and execution by hanging or burning. The communal spectacle of execution reinforced social norms. The crowd watched a woman die, and in doing so reaffirmed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. For those accused and executed, there was little recourse. Trials were often based on spectral evidence, dreams, visions, hearsay, and confessions extracted under torture. The European witch hunts peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, but the seeds of the terror lay in late medieval conceptions of lustful, dangerous women. It is important to note that men were also accused and executed as witches, and male sexuality was not immune to suspicion. Stories of priests consorting with succubi, or of warlocks ensnaring young women with love potions, circulated widely. However, the overwhelming majority of accused witches were women, and the rhetoric of demonology focused on female carnal weakness. The fusion of misogyny and fear of desire produced a deadly combination. By portraying sexual appetite as evidence of pacts with the devil, authorities could justify extreme measures against those who did not conform. The witch hunts remind us that controlling women's sexuality was not only a matter of rules and rituals, but also of violence, persecution, and death. Understanding the intersection of witchcraft and sexuality in the medieval imagination helps us see how deeply bodies and souls were entwined. In a world where disasters demanded explanations, the suspicion that a neighbor's lust could bring down divine wrath or demonic intrusion reveals how precarious life felt. The tragedies of the witch hunts lie not only in the loss of life, but also in the chilling message they sent. That a woman's desire, knowledge, or independence could make her a target for flames. Although centuries separate us from the medieval world, echoes of its sexual norms reverberate in modern society. We may no longer consult penitential manuals to determine when it is licit to make love, nor do we send midwives to verify hymens, yet the underlying ideas about controlling female sexuality, moralizing pleasure, and linking bodies to broader social order remain surprisingly resilient. Examining the continuities between then and now, reveals not only how far we have come, but also how deeply ingrained some attitudes are. One obvious legacy is the persistence of the virgin-whore dichotomy. Medieval culture idolized virgins, epitomized by the Virgin Mary, while condemning fallen women. Today we see similar labels in the forms of pure versus promiscuous, girl next door versus slut. Despite advances in sexual freedom, women are still judged by the number of their sexual partners, their clothing, or their willingness to conform to certain standards. The double standard that allows men to be praised for sexual conquests while women are shamed has medieval roots in the legal and social emphasis on virginity and fidelity for women. Modern debates over abstinence-only education, purity pledges, and hymenoplasty surgeries reveal how the idea that a woman's worth is tied to her sexual history has yet to disappear entirely. The regulation of reproduction also shows continuity. In the Middle Ages, the church and secular authorities sought to ensure that sex led to legitimate heirs, punishing contraception, abortion, and extramarital births. While contemporary legal frameworks differ, the politicization of reproductive rights remains a battleground. Laws restricting access to contraception and abortion in various countries echo medieval anxieties about controlling women's bodies to preserve social order. The rhetoric may now reference religion, public health, or demographics. But the underlying concern about who gets to decide when and how a woman becomes a mother is familiar. Cases in which teenagers are forced to carry pregnancies to term or in which women are criminalized for miscarriages recall the punitive attitudes of earlier eras. Shame remains a tool of control. Confession may have moved from the priest IS ear to the therapist IS couch or the social media platform, but the impulse to police desire persists. Women and men alike internalize messages about what is proper, struggle with guilt over desires that do not fit societal norms, and face ostracism for deviating. Online slut-shaming, the circulation of revenge porn, and the use of virginity tests on rape survivors are modern forms of communal surveillance and punishment. Religious sermons condemning masturbation or premarital sex now compete with secular voices that judge bodies based on attractiveness and performance. The mediums have changed, but the feeling of being watched and judged for sexual behavior remains. As our journey through the most bizarre and troubling aspects of medieval sexuality draws to a close, let us pause to reflect on what we have seen and how it makes us feel. We have wandered through cold stone corridors where married couples whispered prayers before touching each other. We have slipped into confessional shadows where men and women unburdened themselves of secrets that weighed heavily on their souls. We have stood at the edges of brothel districts and pilgrimage roads, listening to the laughter of prostitutes and the admonitions of preachers. We have sat beside women forced into marriages, hidden under veils, and watched them surrender their bodies to men chosen for them by others. We have heard the screams of the accused as flames consumed them, punished not only for alleged magic, but for embodying a sexuality that frightened their neighbors. These images linger like the smell of smoke or the chill of winter, haunting and poignant. There is a temptation, when faced with such darkness, to turn away or to congratulate ourselves on our progress. It is true that many of the practices we have explored, chastity belts, virginity tests, witch trials, no longer have legal force, but the impulses that gave rise to them are part of the human condition. Fear of what we cannot control, desire to protect what we value, willingness to sacrifice the freedom of some for the perceived security of all. Medieval people did not think of themselves as cruel. They believed they were upholding divine order, ensuring social stability, and guarding souls against eternal damnation. Their solutions may seem grotesque to us, but their anxieties are not wholly alien. When we shame a teenager for being too slutty, when we tell survivors of assault that they must have asked for it, when we legislate to restrict access to reproductive health care, we echo the same desire to police bodies and impose our moral frameworks on others. Yet the story is also one of resilience and tenderness. Within the strictures of their society, people carved out spaces of intimacy and joy. A husband and wife who were forced into marriage might learn to love one another. Lovers composed poetry that transcended the limits set upon them. Midwives used their knowledge to save lives. Sex workers formed communities of care, sharing resources and information. Women accused of witchcraft sometimes banded together to protect each other. Even those who suffered found ways to leave traces of their humanity in letters, court pleas, and songs. These acts of defiance and compassion shine like candles in the dark, reminding us that people are never only victims of their circumstances. They improvise, they endure, and they imagine alternatives. As you lie in your bed, perhaps you feel gratitude for the freedoms you enjoy, or sorrow for those who did not. Perhaps you feel a connection to the nameless women who walked along muddy roads to a brothel, or to the men who shivered in confessionals, frightened of their own bodies. History can be a comfort not because it is romantic, but because it is shared. Knowing that humans before us grappled with sex, love, shame, and power in complicated ways can make us feel less alone in our own struggles. It can also inspire us to be gentler with ourselves and more patient with others. When we see how harmful beliefs have been transmitted across generations, we can choose to break the chain. In the quiet that follows, let these stories settle. Let the images soften and the voices fade. Imagine the crackle of a hearth as embers glow, the feel of wool blankets against your skin, the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. In the distance, a church bell tolls, marking the passage of time as it has for centuries. The snow may be falling outside your window, or perhaps crickets are chirping in summer fields. But here, in this space between past and present, you are safe. You are free to sleep, to dream, to carry with you the lessons and the empathy this tale has offered. Good night.